AI, there's a huge race going on as to who's going to meet the new technological frontier, who's going to be able to lead there, and there's going to be huge ramifications for all of our economies around the world. And there is a rush to acquire any semblance of advantage from corporate espionage standpoint. So there's countries and individual groups that are targeting the theft of this technology space in particular.
Welcome to another episode of Mandiant's Defender's Advantage podcast. I'm your host, Luke McNamara. Today, I have the pleasure of being joined by Imran Ahmad, the Senior Partner and Canadian Head of Technology and Canadian Co-Head of Cybersecurity and Data Privacy at Norton Rose Fulbright. Imran, how are you doing today?
I'm doing well, Luke. Thanks for having me. I'm looking forward to this conversation we're going to have.
As am I, and I think to kind of provide some background prior to, I guess, when we get into what we're going to discuss today, maybe talk a little bit about your role and how you engage with customers and your clients at Norton Rose Fulbright.
Yeah, no, for sure. You actually did a great intro there for me. I head up our technology law practice, and just for your listeners, about 20 years ago, when I started practicing law, I was primarily focused on technology work. So this was your traditional commercial contracting of technology agreements. So think of large outsourcing agreements, cloud computing agreements, those kind of things. And that morphed over time about 15 years ago to more privacy work and then cyber. So the work I started doing here at the firm and even at my prior firm was really on what we call incident response, which I'm sure we'll talk about a bit more in detail, really helping clients, focusing on dealing with breaches and making sure that they're either responding it to effectively or as prepared as they can be before an incident occurs to respond to it effectively. So in my role at the firm, I head up our tech group for sure, as we still do the technology contracting piece I talked about, but also a big chunk of the work is helping clients be ready and responding in real time. I co-chair the group for cyber with my very good partner John Castle, who's based in Calgary. I myself split my time between our Toronto and Montreal office, and supported by a fantastic group of lawyers here in Canada and globally.
And what are some of the typical roles you're engaging with, either on the preparatory side or during a breach response? The sort of roles on the other side of the customer.
Yeah, no, it's a great question. I mean, on the pre-breach side, it's more, I'll say, it is much more relaxed in some respects because you're not dealing with an active threat. You can work with a client to do what we call tabletop exercises, which is basically running through a hypothetical scenario and seeing how they respond. They can be as basic or as complex as the organization would like to test it out at level that makes sense to them. We do a lot of contract reviews for them to make sure that they understand what their legal obligations are in the event of a breach, but also, more importantly, what should they be putting in before they sign an agreement with a third party vendor who may be holding or touching their data or their systems. We do a lot of work, especially post SCC rules on disclosure requirements on cyber oversight and governance. Work with the boards. What is their fiduciary obligation? We often sit as ongoing advisors, which I know also Mandiant does quite a bit in terms of tracking KPIs, seeing what they're doing, how can they improve, because the threat is always evolving. So that's at a very high level on the pre-breach side of things. And like I said, it's less stressful in some respect because you're preparing for the worst case, but you're not dealing with the worst case at that point necessarily. The second piece is the response side, the IR part, the incident response component. That one is pretty intense. I often talk to some younger lawyers or people who want to develop a career in cybersecurity. And I often say it's like the adrenaline sport portion of our practice. Clients call typically late at night before a weekend or a long weekend, reporting back that their systems are down, they're dealing with a crisis, and at that point, it's not just all hands on deck, but all multiple team members on deck, not just legal, but certainly forensics. You may have crisis communication, you may have ransom negotiations, experts coming in. So it really is pulling the A team together to respond to that incident like in real time, very quickly with extremely compressed timelines. Last point on that, which is I find it stimulating from an intellectual and legal perspective. Some people find it a bit too stressful. Is you are in the trenches with the client, literally talking to their CEO, talking to their board, talking to their general counsel on strategy with very imperfect information. and it makes it for a much more challenging environment to give advice in, but one which ultimately, if you have experience and you've done this a lot of times, is very satisfying and rewarding for when the client has passed through that crisis.
And you kind of hinted at this a little bit already, but where, for a law firm like Norton Rose Fulbright, would you be engaging with an incident response, other sort of consulting provider like Mandiant? How do you work with us, either on the preparatory side or those breach response stage?
So I sort of alluded to this, and it's a great question you asked, Luke. When it comes to cyber, it is a team sport, and it's not just a nice, expression to use in these situations. It really is. Because what we have in these situations, either during a live incident or preparatory side, and I'll get into the specifics of what we do with the team at Mandiant, you're pulling this A team together, like I said, quickly. And each member of that A team, A has an expertise and B has a role to play within that overall response. So super important to have the right folks doing the right thing. Like for example, we work with Mandiant on crises, especially on incident responses regularly. And they're going to be in there to contain the incident, make sure that we're restoring appropriately, i.e., as securely as possible, and then doing the forensic investigation. And literally, we are hand in glove working together. We are there because I need to be able to give real time advice to the CEO or the general counsel based on where Mandiant may be in their investigation, what they're finding. I need to talk to the comms people as to what we can or cannot say based on what facts we're discovering on the ground and so on. So, very much a partnership kind of relationship, not just with Mandy certainly, but also with those other team members I mentioned, like comms, or for example, legal, or other folks within the organization. So we do a ton of that work with the Mandian team on the incident response. But on the pre-breach side, again, we are lawyers. Our team is there to advise on legal issues, talk about strategy, obviously minimize risk for the organization. Well, I mean, I'm pretty technical, so is our team, but we're not forensic investigators. We're not threat intelligence gatherers. You guys have that tool or those tools available to you to be able to feed that to us. So on the pre-breach side, when we're designing scenarios, for example, for tabletop exercises, we could do one on legal, and that's super helpful and plays a role. But we could also do one which involves the information security team. And for that, the scenario has to have a technical drill component, which is then coupled with legal and coupled with the board, coupled with comms and a variety of other things. So you guys play a very critical role even on that scenario planning on the pre-breach side of things as well.
So one of the things I'm really excited to pick your brain around is some of the conversations that you've been having with your clients over the last year, and especially in those sorts of C-suite roles at the board level. I'm curious to know, what are the sorts of conversations you've been having? What are the things that are top of mind for them when it comes to cybersecurity? There's always a lot that is continuously coming out, either in the news, through private intel feeds, in terms of emerging threats, ongoing constant threats. So either from a threat perspective or just generally areas of kind of cyber risk. This is a very, very broad question, but what are the things that you find you're most often having in terms of topics of conversation?
It's a great question because, I go to conferences, I'm sure you do as well. You hear about some of the emerging threats. And what's interesting is when it comes to cyber, every 12 months, 18 months, there's a new angle to something that we've been dealing with because these hackers, they're not static, they're dynamic. So for every move that's made, there's a counter move and a counter move and then another counter move. So we always have to adapt. And I think that's one of the challenges of cybersecurity is to constantly be evolving. So I think there's a few things. Some of these may be sort of table stakes, but others which are now emerging, which are a bit different that I hadn't seen in the past. And just for your audience, so they're aware, in a prior life, I did have quite a bit of exposure in our national security agency here up in Canada, and have been typically very hawkish in terms of cyber threats from a foreign state perspective. What I have often seen over the years is countries who cannot necessarily fight a typical kinetic war, like a military war on the ground, effectively because there's a disparity, will often leverage cyber as a leveling field. So these are happening in the shadows. We, as typical citizens, don't see it every single day, but there's a lot of things happening in the background that I'm sure the Mandian team tracks regularly. I know they feed us some intel as well, and we track in terms of clients who are in various industries. So what's new is two things, maybe three. One, I've seen a lot more activity by state-sponsored threat actors to target critical infrastructures, much more than in the past, where the vast majority of the breaches we had seen for years and years was primarily motivated by financial gain. We're now seeing some that are focused on strictly geopolitical motivations. And candidly, not to scare your audience, we live in a dangerous world, and cyber is a tool to attack and cause harm to countries. They target critical infrastructure like oil and gas, energy, financial services, healthcare, to be able to make a point, not so much because they actually want to make financial gains out of it, that attack. The second thing I have seen a huge uptick on, and it's quite timely because it's very much focused on corporate espionage with AI. AI, there's a huge race going on as to who's going to meet that new technological frontier, who's going to be able to lead there, and there's going to be huge ramifications for all of our economies around the world. And there is a rush to acquire any semblance of advantage from corporate espionage standpoint. So there's countries and individual groups that are targeting the theft of this technology space in particular. And then the third thing, probably a bit more on a lighter note, not as scary, is boards are very alive to cyber risks. They've seen what's been going on both from litigation, and you hear about the hearings at Congress and so on when a major breach occurs. They want to make sure, and they're more involved, that the cyber risk posture is within an acceptable standard for their organization. So there's a bit more involvement than what we had seen in previous years. A lot of board education, a lot of understanding of what KPIs are being tracked and how and why, really a big focus on industry regulatory compliance, and that also includes SEC requirements, the Securities Exchange Commission requirements on board oversight and what they may be judged on down the road. So I'd say those would be the three: geopolitical risks related to cyber, corporate espionage being the second, and the third would be a real focus by the boards in cyber risk oversight management.
Kind of on that one point of cyber risk oversight management, and you mentioned kind of education and educating the board. How do you think about that process of communicating threats, educating the board? What do you find to be most useful? Because these are individuals where maybe cyber is not their day job, and this is not something where necessarily they're trying to become an expert in. And if you're just maybe a casual reader of what is going on in the news, it may be overwhelming. It may be difficult to say, okay, what are the categories of cyber risk I need to prioritize? So, how do you think about approaching that area of kind of educating the board in particular about these are the categories of cyber risk that maybe you really need to get smart on?
One of the things I've enjoyed over the years when talking to boards is they're so diverse and so smart. Like, they have experience which is really relevant for their board position, and a lot of these board members are not coming at it just from a pure cybersecurity standpoint. They're looking at it from a broader enterprise risk management. So pick any company, whatever industry they may be in, they may be saying, well, okay, I am concerned about cyber for sure because we have technological dependencies on X, Y, or Z. But I'm also concerned about reputational harm. I'm concerned about an M&A deal we're going to be doing in the next little while and the impact a cyber attack could have on that and so on. So they have a pretty holistic view. What they need and what they want to see from management and from their advisors is take this threat intelligence information and current landscape and tell me for my organization specifically what are the risks, A, and then B, what are the mitigation strategies we need to do and put in place. And in some cases, they're pretty straightforward. In other cases, there's some difficult decisions to make, like on budget, on resource, on hiring, even on when you acquire a company. What is the risk from a cyber threat landscape perspective? Do we delay or phase in the integration of the two companies over time because of X, Y, or Z reasons? So it can be really challenging, but what they're looking for is give me the lay of the land today and then tell me how I can mitigate it, and then I will make the decision as a board or as a group, as a risk committee if it's allocated to the sub risk committee as to how we do that. The other thing they're very interested in is ongoing education. This is across any company, but most boards will have a continuing education program they have to go through during the year. The number one and two areas that they're interested in are cyber risk and AI risk. Risk, but also opportunities at the same time. Cyber, we often see more as a risk, because it can bring down operations or it can have a financial impact, can lead to litigation. But when it comes to AI in particular, I know sort of slightly off topic. Yes, there's the risk of AI. If it goes wrong, if we have biases in data sets, how could that hurt our reputation? But what are the opportunities for the company or the organization to utilize AI for increased productivity and so on and so forth? So I think the boards look at it from a risk perspective primarily and looking for their advisors not to just come and scare them about what the risks are, but how do they fix it?
Diving a little bit deeper into one particular problem, I think it's been very difficult to have a conversation around cyber threats without touching on ransomware. Certainly, it's been something that has dominated a lot of the conversations that we have with customers, certainly at least the last 4 or 5 years. When you think about that category of disruptive threats, where there's a potential impact to continuity of operations in the business, you're a manufacturing company and you can't ship out or receive orders, for example, it seems to have really shaped how a lot of organizations, and maybe it's industry specific to an extent, but it's shaped how organizations think about cyber threat. When you think about that category of threat, what are some of the ways that you're seeing, maybe at the C-suite level or at the risk committee level, organizations thinking about either preparing for or even how we would respond to that category of threat?
So what's interesting is, Luke, over the last few years, there's been an evolution, where before it was a question of being informed at the board level what the risks are and making sure nothing got through. It's only that one time a hacker has to be successful to cause significant harm. There's been a real shift towards let's emphasize building resiliency within the organization. And the way I define resiliency is probably not the most technical way of looking at it, is being punched in the gut and being able to get back up as quickly as you can as an organization. So if a hacker comes in and shuts down your operations, how quickly can you get back up and running? And I often give this example. So I teach a course on cybersecurity. I've been teaching it for about 8 or 9 years now at the Faculty of Law here in Toronto at the University of Toronto. And one of the first things I do in the class I teach is I ask students to take their laptop or their iPad, spend 15 minutes, go online, find any breach, and there's no jurisdiction restriction, there's no time restriction. Find the 2 or 3 worst managed breaches in their opinion. And then we come back as a group and we talk about it. And what's interesting is there's always 3 things that come up. So one is, wow, Professor Ahmad, they were down for a really long time. So you ask them the question, why do you say that? Wouldn't they be down in any event if they got hacked? The short answer was, look, we get a day, a couple of days, maybe a week. We don't understand how somebody can be down multiple weeks or months. And the impression the students had was the longer you're down, the less prepared you may have been in terms of disaster recovery or business continuity. The second thing they came back with in terms of, why they felt these were not well managed breaches was the communication was really bad. Either they didn't communicate at all, they communicated very slowly, or even worse, they had to correct communications they had already issued, which is never a good sign. And the reason that didn't sit well with people was it seemed like the organization that was a victim of this attack didn't have control over the situation. The third thing, and the last thing that's probably relevant, and I put less weight on this, but it's still from an optics perspective something to think about, is there's so many breaches going on around the world, but there are very few of them, a small portion, believe it or not, that are actively investigated or where litigation ensues or there is a regulatory formal investigation that commences. And the perception was, well, if you have a lot of litigation and you have a lot of regulatory investigations, maybe there's a fire where we see this smoke. And like I said, I put less weight on that because that's an optics and a perception, and each thing is case by case. But you take those 3 things together, those stand out. So when we're talking to these boards in terms of what they should be thinking about, the goal is not to be perfect, but the goal is to have the resiliency within the organization so you can be up and running quickly, so that you are communicating and are in control of that communication piece. And if you can avoid it, or even if you are investigated, that you can be successful in demonstrating at the end of the day that you acted reasonably and as efficiently and quickly as possible.
And when you think about how this category of extortion threats have evolved, and the fact that we're seeing more data theft and the sort of public leaking, these name and shame sites, these data leak sites associated often with ransomware brands, ransomware threat actors, has that changed how organizations view this risk? because now you're no longer just thinking about or having to consider the impact to your operations and getting back up and running, but also, is there potentially more regulatory or privacy exposure from this category of extortion now?
Certainly from a legal perspective, I mean, look, if data is being dumped on the dark web because the hacker stole it, you automatically there'll be a trigger in some respects in terms of privacy notifications or other types of communication they need to put out to business partners. Again, it all depends on the sensitivity and the type of information impacted. I'm sort of of two minds, and it depends on which camp you find yourself in a given situation. There's one camp, especially a lot of folks that I talk to in the communication side of things, that may say, "Look, there's so many breaches happening, Imran, that people are being desensitized to it to a certain level. That you get a notice once in your lifetime, you'll probably be very concerned, but if you get 20 of them over a 2-year period, you'll just get desensitized." I'm not sure about that. I think it's one way of looking at it. The other one is you are not going to be judged by the fact you had a breach, it's how you respond to the breach. So there is some value in having a really robust communications program ready to go. You don't have to open kimono from A to Z, but certainly you want to be able to communicate relevant facts and be there for that stakeholder, that it be a customer or a shareholder or the market or the media, whoever that stakeholder or stakeholders are. You got to be there and be able to support them through that process.
Do you think there's any certain categories of cyber risk that in your conversations now you think maybe are being underappreciated to the extent to which they present actual risk? I mean, you touched on, for example, earlier the threats posed by nation state actors and that sort of category of cyber espionage where, maybe you're a pharmaceutical company, your IP is stolen in a breach. You don't see immediate impact to your operations. Your systems are still up and running. There's no extortion ransom fee that you have to pay to get data back. But maybe ultimately that has an impact because a rival product comes on the market somewhere that you do business. So, are there categories like maybe that one in particular, but other areas where just there's not as much attention to the extent that there should be on an area of cyber risk?
Yeah, let me actually pick up on that one, and then I'll share another one, which is probably a bit less exciting, but one which is much more common. But I think when we look at corporate espionage, which is something I personally feel, this is my Imran Ahmad personal view on this piece, it is underappreciated, and it's a clear and present risk every single day. Looking at it from a North American perspective, just Canada, US, for example, the level of innovation and R&D dollars spent in innovation is huge. You spend years and years and years, as either as a startup, a scale up, a large enterprise, pumping money, hiring experts, investing in education, and so on of your existing staff. And on a moment's attack, you could lose that technology. And there's some well documented cases in terms of telecommunication company equipment that may have been compromised, something in the nuclear area, that construction of nuclear plants that may have been compromised years ago, and a variety of others, where companies that were at the bleeding edge of technology had to basically disappear or scale down because they lost that critical R&D, and that showed up somewhere else in the world at less expensive cost and at an advantage for that competitor. So that is something we absolutely have to do. I'll give you an example. During the pandemic, you may recall the first half, regrettably, of the pandemic, there was no vaccine. And there was a huge rush in the pharma space to develop a vaccine, and a ton of resources were being poured into it. But when you look at the broader pharma ecosystem, certainly you have the pharma companies, but you also have clinical trial companies, you've got research facilities at universities and other places. We had seen a significant uptick in terms of targeted attacks by states, sometimes by groups, looking to acquire that specific intel, that R&D, that IP, intellectual property. And how did we find it? Because when folks like Mandiant were our forensic investigators, they would basically look at the breadcrumbs and see, well, these were the directories they were going through. These were the commands they were looking for. Here are the folders they may have searched. And it doesn't take a lot of effort to figure out that these folks, the hackers, were trying to get information about the development of a vaccine. And you can go down the list. I mentioned AI being one area where there's a lot of investment going on. That's a key area where we saw and we continue to see cyber attacks happening for corporate espionage purposes. The goal there is not to create a lot of havoc or even be noticed. The goal is to go in, watch, and take what may be relevant for that hacker person or group who's doing it. So much more difficult to track in some respects, and much more difficult, candidly, to ascertain what was taken and to what extent that loss is going to impact the bottom line. The other example that you asked about, what is underappreciated. You're going to laugh about this, but it's the old classic business email compromise. For your audience members who are less familiar with it, imagine being at work. You have a corporate email address and you get a phishing email, perhaps that looks, really legitimate. You click through it, doesn't go anywhere, and you just assume maybe it's a bad link, or maybe your computer is not connected properly. It's at work, so maybe that's what happened here. You'll wait for the next alert. Meanwhile, on the back end, your MFA, multi-factor token, has been compromised somehow, or somehow the access has been obtained by the hacker. And what they typically want to do is some kind of financial fraud. They want to transfer the funds to another bank account that they potentially control or have access to, and so on. I'm grossly simplifying the BEC financial fraud piece, but that's what we're looking at. So here's the funny and interesting part in terms of how quote unquote that has evolved, is the use of AI in the deepfake piece. The often given advice was, if you're going to transfer funds to a new bank account, make sure you do an analog check, call the person on the other side. If you can do a video conference, even better, so on and so forth. But now with the use of AI and deepfakes, you can recreate a lot of stuff by capturing people's images and voices, which is readily available these days in many ways, and do those transfers. Now, the reason I say it's underrated as a risk is twofold. One, we often think multi-factor authentication is going to resolve everything, and unfortunately, there are ways to get around it, as you know, and I'm sure many of your audience members know. So they can get around MFAs like having nothing in place. But the second piece is the cost, the infrastructure to do this kind of financial fraud is extremely low. Hence, the quantity of these attacks are significant compared to a ransomware attack, which may require more of an infrastructure. You need to have, believe it or not, some kind of drive or data centers where you can keep the data that you steal. You need to have a supply chain, one who compromises credentials all the way down the chain to the negotiator. You have to be able to mix the currencies, the cryptocurrencies that you're obtaining through these global mixers, and then move them to accounts and then turn them into fiat. So there's a whole machine behind that. That takes time and that can be brought down. But the BEC, it's not too difficult to take advantage of that, and there's big money involved. So I'd say those would be the two, the corporate espionage piece, and certainly the second one, which is the good old business email compromise, if you want to call it that.
Yeah, on that, the business email compromise, we put out a blog. Actually, some of our pen testers, red teamers, engaged and sort of proved that or showcase ways you could use voice spoofing and phishing, email, voice based phishing to compromise an organization. And they did, just as you noted, being able to train a model with recordings of, so you have an executive who's on the news all the time, right? And there's plenty of public recordings of that, and then being able to kind of spoof their voice. So I think there's an interesting, certainly, and there's been several news stories where either audio or visual deepfakes have been leveraged in business email compromise like incidents. I think there's an interesting question around to what extent will threat actors adopt what might at least right now be more complex ways to carry out that activity. As you know, like the simple email based method of business email compromise is still very effective and still makes up the most of what is kind of going on in that space. And there's this interesting, I think, question around how we anticipate a certain technology might be employed by threat actors and how they might actually use it. But the other piece I think is also really interesting that you touched on is this lowering of barriers to entry, because I don't think that the cybercrime ecosystem is ever static when it comes to entrance, right? There's always the potential globally for new actors to enter that space. And I think as you see some of these as a service like components to the ecosystem, whether it's web skimming or tools to do business email compromise more efficiently, it is an interesting question around how will that change the environment? Will we see more threat actors doing things? And will more threat actors have the ability to leverage techniques that in the past only more skilled threat actors would do?
I agree with you. I think if I had to be a guessing or a betting person, I think the barriers to entry have materially decreased, and it will continue to be that way. One of the interesting part, I was watching a great documentary on the BBC the other day, and they were talking about this whole why did ChatGPT take off the way it did when it was released almost 2 years ago? Well, it did because the interface was so easy. And one of the commentators said, back maybe 5, 6, 7, 8 years ago, we were telling a lot of young folks, you got to do coding. Well, coding is not necessarily what you need to do now to get access to the most complicated and sophisticated tools that are out there. So a lot more questions come to mind in terms of what would be the barrier to entry. If you've got a computer and a keyboard and a couple of basic tools which are readily available, arguably you have all you need to do some harm if you have malicious intent.
So we've covered a lot of ground here. Maybe tying this all together, what are some of the kind of areas of maybe there are opportunities around board education, engagement with C suites, getting them more involved in preparatory steps, things like tabletop exercises, things like that you're excited about this year, or also just areas of maybe risk that people should be considering? We're recording this in early February. What's kind of your outlook on the cyber risk landscape there?
So a couple of positive things because I know we're probably coming to the end of our conversation, so I want to leave on a positive note instead of just being doom and gloom. But
Always when we can. It's always good in cyber if we can end on a positive note.
well, a couple good trends that are happening, which are I think worth mentioning. One, if you go back, and I'm sure you remember this, 10 years ago, trying to get attention of the board on cyber was not as easy as we think it is now. But the boards now are very, very alive to this. Leadership teams are very alive, and not just alive about the risk, but they're alive to the fact they have to invest in being prepared for it. So that is a good place to be to have these conversations. I think the other thing that's a positive is just talking about the examples earlier about tabletop exercises. A lot of clients have already done these. They've done sort of the initial, tabletop 101 or 2.0, but now what they're looking for is, okay, let's stretch. Let's go and see how far we can take this. Let's challenge ourselves a bit more. The folks who are there in our organization, that it be the CFO or the COO or the compliance officer, the CISO, or go down the list of who would be typically on an incident response team. They want to push the limit to see how far they can go with a difficult scenario and make the best possible decision. So we're seeing more complexity being built into these tabletops, which candidly are hard to put together because it requires a lot of coordination between the technical folks, certainly the governance folks. In some cases, we have board members who attend not to participate, but as observers. Obviously, there's a lot of preparation and role definition that has to happen in those situations. But I'm seeing a lot more sophistication. The joke I often share with our team here at Norton Rose is it's a bit like Star Trek. I don't know if you remember that show with Captain Kirk, the old one, and the story goes something like this. Captain Kirk was a cadet in the academy, and he would to pass the officer test, you need to do this Kobayashi Maru test, where you're given bad and worse options. And in the story, Captain Kirk basically changes the algorithm to basically make it such that he wins, which is not the outcome Starfleet wants in that scenario. The reason I tell the story is because what they're trying to test in that actual real scenario, not the one that Captain Kirk changed, was how would you respond to a high stress lose lose scenario? And often in a cyber crisis, you're dealing with bad and worse options. So the goal here is not so much to get the right answer. The goal is to see, do you have the muscle memory, the reflex to be able to do certain things in a quick, compressed timeline? And I think when you do those really complex tabletops, that's what I'm seeing boards, certainly leadership teams, information security teams asking for in terms of their tabletops. So that's very positive. In terms of risks for 2025, it's a bit hard to say. Everything that I have seen in roughly about a month or so, we're into the year, plus what I've read and the conversations I've had with folks at Mandiant or elsewhere, we've seen a slight decrease at the beginning of the year in terms of the traditional ransomware attacks, but they haven't gone away. And there's an expectation it's going to increase. This is a risk that's not going to go away. So, how do you adapt to it? Is something that comes up a lot. And last point, you and I just touched on this prior to this last point, which was the use of deep fakes in very basic cyber attacks like wire transfers. We're seeing a lot more sophistication in that. The email that looks like a legitimate email coming from an e-commerce business you do business with, or a message coming from your cell phone service provider. And what they can do with these AI tools now is collect a ton of information. So If I was a hacker pre AI use, I would have to go and say, okay, well, let me target Imran. Let's go on his LinkedIn. Let's go on his Facebook. Let's go figure out what's on Norton Rose's website about him. Try to put it together. Then I craft an email that would look legit, and then send it off. Now, what with AI you can do is have that all that information scraped, put into a database, and hit hundreds of Imrans with very specific issues. What university did you go to? Who's your contact here and there? And make it so legit looking, even though it's fraudulent, that you could dupe the most, connoisseur of people out there who would have picked this up otherwise.
Well, a lot to think about. We got the positive outlook, and then also the thing to be watching from a risk perspective, fitting them both in there at the end. But Imran, thanks for your time and sharing your insights. This has been an excellent conversation. I think hopefully we'll kind of frame certainly a lot of the ways that I'm thinking about this year and engaging with some of our customers. So thank you for your time today.
No, thanks for having me. It was a great conversation. Hope we can do it again soon.